The pressure no one talks about. Peer pressure, porn, and what we aren't telling our kids. Welcome back to Let's Talk About It. I'm Sherry Lopez. Today I want to talk about something we don't talk about nearly enough: porn. But probably not in the way you're expecting. I'm not interested in spending this time telling parents how terrible the internet is, or telling kids don't look at porn. They already know adults don't want them looking at it. I want to talk about how they get there in the first place. Because sometimes a kid doesn't go looking for porn. Porn finds them. A friend shows them something. Someone sends something in a group chat. A kid at school says, "You've got to see this." Someone turns a phone around. And there it is. 5 seconds earlier, that kid wasn't looking for pornography. Now they're looking at something they may never have seen before. And what happens next? That's the conversation I think we're missing. This is something I write about in my book, Before It Hooks You, because I don't think we prepare young people enough for the pressure that comes with all of this. Nobody really sits a boy down and says, at some point, someone may show you something sexual. What are you going to do when that happens? We tell kids not to do things, but we don't always prepare them for the moment when somebody else is standing beside them, encouraging them to do it. And that's a very different situation. No one really sits you down and says, hey, this is something you're going to have to deal with. But it's there in conversations, in jokes, in group chats, in what people send each other. There's this unspoken pressure that says this is normal and you should be into it. And if you're not, it can feel like you're the odd one out. A lot of guys don't get into porn because they were looking for it. They get into it because it's around them. Someone shows them something. Someone sends a link. Or someone makes it sound like everyone is doing it. And you don't want to be the one who doesn't get it. You don't want to be the one who says no, because that can feel awkward. So you go along with it, not because you really want to, but because you don't want to feel left out. That's how a lot of this starts, not from a clear decision, from pressure. And pressure doesn't always look like someone standing over you saying, "Do this." Sometimes pressure sounds like laughter. "Come on, man. You've never seen this? Everybody watches it. What's wrong with you?" Sometimes nobody even says anything. It's just understood. You're a guy. You're supposed to like this. You're supposed to want to see it. You're supposed to know what everybody is talking about. And if you don't, you can start wondering if there's something wrong with you. There isn't. And I wish we told boys that more often. Because here's something else nobody talks about. Some of the guys doing the pressuring may be feeling pressured themselves. They're going along because somebody else went along. Nobody wants to be the person who stands up and says, actually, I don't want to see that. So everybody assumes everybody else is comfortable, and maybe nobody is. That's what pressure does. It doesn't always force you. It just makes going along feel easier than stopping and thinking for yourself. Then something else can happen. Going along becomes a habit. At first, maybe somebody showed it to you. Then you look again. Then again. Eventually, something that started with everybody else is doing it can become, why do I keep going back to this? And that's where the title of my book, Before It Hooks You, comes from. I want young people to understand these things before they find themselves somewhere they never intended to be. before the habit, before the secrecy, before the pressure gets stronger, before someone takes advantage of their curiosity, before it hooks them. Because the hard thing about peer pressure is that it usually doesn't feel like peer pressure while it's happening. It feels like fitting in. It feels like being part of the group. It feels normal. But normal and healthy aren't always the same thing. And just because everyone around you seems to be doing something doesn't mean you have to do it too. There's a difference between fitting in and giving away your ability to think for yourself. And sometimes we don't realize we've crossed that line. I especially want boys and young men to hear this. You are allowed to have sexual boundaries. I know that sounds ridiculously obvious, but look at the messages we send boys. If an older woman shows sexual interest in a teenage boy, what do people sometimes say? Man, he's lucky. I would have loved that at his age. They joke about it. They congratulate him. But what if he didn't want it? What if he was uncomfortable? What if an adult manipulated him? What if he was groomed? We don't get to decide that something wasn't harmful simply because the victim was male. Boys can be groomed. Boys can be manipulated. Boys can be sexually exploited. And boys don't have to enjoy sexual attention just because they're boys. We need to say that out loud. We also need to talk about what pornography can teach young people when nobody else is talking to them about sex. Because if adults won't have the conversation, something else will. And porn is a terrible relationship teacher. It doesn't teach someone how to love another person. It doesn't teach communication. It doesn't teach what it feels like to care about somebody. It doesn't teach you how to recognize when someone is uncomfortable. It doesn't teach healthy boundaries. Yet a young person can start thinking, well, I guess this is what sex is supposed to look like. Then those expectations can show up in real relationships. A boy may think his girlfriend is supposed to do something because he's watched other people doing it. A girl may think she has to agree because she believes that's what boys expect. A boy may wonder what's wrong with him because his real experiences don't look anything like what he's seen online. And suddenly something that was on a screen isn't staying on the screen anymore. It's shaping expectations. That's worth talking about, not with shame, with honesty. And this is where I also want to bring grooming into the conversation. As a survivor of grooming and human trafficking, I know firsthand that grooming doesn't usually begin with something terrifying. If it did, we'd recognize it much more easily. It can begin with attention, curiosity, trust. A little boundary crossed here, another one there, and sexual material can sometimes be part of that process. A sexual joke, then another one. Have you ever seen this? Don't be so innocent. Everybody does it. Then maybe it's, send me something. I'll send you one. Don't tell anybody. Look at how quickly the conversation can change. That doesn't mean every kid who encounters pornography is being groomed. Of course not. But someone who wants to groom a young person can use sexual content to see how that young person responds. Will they look? Will they participate? Will they keep a secret? Can I push this boundary a little farther? That's what I want young people to recognize, because sometimes the danger isn't the first thing somebody asks you to do. It's where they're trying to take you next. And then there's sextortion. This is another conversation we absolutely need to be having with our kids. Maybe a teenager sends somebody a picture. Maybe they thought the other person was another teenager. Maybe they liked the attention. Maybe they were curious. Maybe they were pressured. Maybe they made a decision they regret. Then suddenly, send another one, or I'm posting this. Give me money. I'm sending this to your parents. I know where you go to school. I have your friends list. Imagine being 14 years old and reading that. Imagine being 15, 16. Imagine thinking your entire life is about to fall apart because of one picture. And then imagine believing you can't tell your parents because they'll be furious with you. That's why the way we talk to our kids before something happens matters so much. I want a child to know, if you mess up, come home. If somebody threatens you, tell me. If you're scared, wake me up. We'll figure it out. That doesn't mean parents can't have rules. Of course they can. It doesn't mean choices don't have consequences. They do. But when your child is being threatened, that's not the time for I told you so. Your kid needs you. And if you're a young person listening to me and somebody has a picture of you and they're threatening you with it, please tell somebody. I don't care if you're embarrassed. I don't care if you broke a rule. I don't care if the person told you everything will get worse if you tell. Tell, because the person threatening you needs you to stay silent. One picture does not mean you owe somebody another picture. One conversation doesn't mean you owe somebody a relationship. Accepting someone's attention doesn't mean they own you. Being curious doesn't mean somebody gets to exploit your curiosity. And saying yes to something yesterday does not take away your right to say no today. I wish every young person knew that. And parents, here's what I'd ask you to think about today. Don't just ask your kids, are you watching porn? Ask better questions. Has anybody ever sent you something you didn't ask for? What happens in your group chats? What would you do if somebody showed you something sexual? Do kids ever pressure each other to send pictures? If somebody ever threatened you with a picture, would you feel like you could tell me? And then listen. Don't immediately turn it into a lecture. Because if we want our kids to talk to us about uncomfortable things, they need some evidence that we can actually handle hearing uncomfortable things. That's a big part of why I wrote Before It Hooks You. I want young people to understand pressure before they're standing in it. I want them to recognize manipulation before they're deeply involved in it. I want them to understand that curiosity is normal, but someone else doesn't get to use that curiosity to push their boundaries. And I want boys to know that being a man doesn't mean proving yourself sexually. It doesn't mean watching what everybody else watches. It doesn't mean accepting attention you don't want. It doesn't mean laughing at something that makes you uncomfortable. Sometimes strength is much quieter than that. Sometimes strength is simply saying, no, not interested. Don't send me that. That's not for me. Or, I need help. That's strength too. You get to decide what you allow into your life. You get to decide what you build habits around. You get to decide where your boundaries are. And you don't need your friend's permission to have them. So I'm going to leave you with the same question I ask in Before It Hooks You. Is this actually something I want, or is this just something I'm being pulled into? Because those aren't the same thing, and knowing the difference can change everything. If today's episode made you think of a young person in your life, don't just send them this podcast. Talk to them. Have the awkward conversation. You don't have to say everything perfectly. You just have to make it safe enough for them to talk back. And if you want to continue that conversation, pick up a copy of my book, Before It Hooks You. I wrote it to talk about the things young people are actually facing, not from a textbook, not by pretending curiosity doesn't exist, and certainly not by shaming them. It's about getting to them before the pressure becomes a habit, before manipulation becomes control, and before something they thought they could handle begins handling them. I'm Sherry Lopez, and this has been another episode of Let's Talk About It. I'll see you next Thursday, and until then, keep talking about the things people would rather avoid. Because sometimes prevention starts with one uncomfortable conversation. Again, you can purchase your copy of Before It Hooks You on Amazon, along with my other books in my Teen Parent series.